me is, you can't go very far. You notice how you go a little ways, right? And last week we were talking about Levi and taxes, tribute to Caesar. And you can't go very far with all of a sudden opening like a cultural Pandora's box. That's what I see all the time in this, because these ideas and concepts are just not familiar to us. Maybe if you've been in my class a gazillion times, and you've absorbed it all, or you're really, really familiar with it. But even then, what I found in my own studying is I have to go to Edersheim, I have to go to all other, many other cultural sources, I have to go to many primary sources just to be able to get this information, to be able to compile it for you. And so, to me it's astounding. You open a box, tribute to Caesar. And we hear about it all the time, right? Well, no, we don't. We hear about what all the time? Taxes. But yet the word teknon means tribute to Caesar, means a tribute that's paid. And even then, how many of you guys paying tribute? Well, I think I'm paying tribute to the federal government, but that's okay. Most of the time we don't even think about paying tribute because we're not paying tribute to a foreign government for the privilege of surviving, of being alive, right? But that was commonplace in the ancient world, especially in the Roman world, unless you were a Roman. And even the Roman citizens, we don't know what kind of tributes they had to pay. Remember in the New Testament, Jesus asked the question to Peter, who pays taxes? Do the people pay taxes? No, foreigners pay taxes. That's the way it worked, right? Today, what do we do? I don't get this, right? Yeah.
Yeah, maybe it's too late. They're coming here making big bucks on businesses they start.
Yeah, how do we do that? All this, we've got all these, people are all biblicalized, right? Remember when we saw in Romans, how that Romans does not tell you to pay taxes to the government, nor to obey the secular authorities? I mean, that's just, if you haven't read Greek, if you think that that's what it says. But it's amazing how since the King James and even since the Vulgate, it's been translated a certain way because the secular authorities were the religious authorities, right? And they want us to obey. Well, that's really special. But Jesus himself told us biblically who's to pay taxes. Foreigners, not us. And I'm like, well, why aren't the pastors preaching this from the pulpits and from every, right?
They don't want to be in jail.
I guess.
You have to pick and choose, right?
I guess you pick and choose, right? Well, Jesus' words are good. Well, it's the same. I've got a really great friend in the Church of Christ, and I always get upset when we don't do it too, because what was Jesus Christ's injunction at the end of John? You should do what to people's feet? Wash their feet. Do you likewise? It's only in John. It's not in the other. But yet, the other, we always do communion, right? Yeah. But Jesus said, you should wash feet. Well, why don't we do it? I mean, those Anglicans do, and so do the Catholics. Even the Pope does.
Seventh-day Adventists.
And also the foot washers as a group, brethren, foot washers, they wash feet.
We did it here one Easter. And the afternoon service for the whole family.
Yeah.
They had a foot washing thing.
I'm just saying, Jesus said do it, right?
Go back to the purpose of washing your feet.
Yes, yes.
One thing is it represents being the servant, and it also serves a purpose. It keeps your feet clean if you're coming in the house. Kick your shoes off before you come in the house.
Well, what's the purpose of having communion? I mean, we miss the whole point, right? Because Paul, we know very clearly that the earliest communions were not like we do it at all. They all had lamb. So where's my lamb? I want my lamb, right? I don't want my lamb. Oh, anyway, I mean, come on, guys. So anyway, let's go to, well, I guess I've got some words of the day for you. I don't know, Tammy said I should try to catch up and I should go backwards, but I'm afraid of going backwards. So,
we're having fun where we're going.
my thing is, maybe I'll have to just do another couple of classes to make sure we get done with Mark. We keep going until we end up at Mark, right? Maybe take a summer sabbatical, but then recap. Because like I said, you know,
Saturday session.
yeah, Saturday session. Well, you open, like I said, you open the box. You open the box and this stuff, and you're there. Let's see, Girio. Girio is that word, and I don't want you to forget about it. And I think I don't think these were last week's, but they may have been. Ekbalo, epibalo. What's the difference between that? Epibalo, meaning, epibalo means to throw upon, Wonder why that is. That's, ekbalo is to throw out, but epibalo means to throw on. These prepositional things. Was this one I gave last week?
Well,
Yeah.
the week before also.
Oh, really? Wait, keep me straight.
So you ready to be tested?
No, I wasn't here the week before, so that doesn't count.
Okay.
Well, I am trying to catch up. This is the one that's the whirlwinds, and this is the one Laila. Let's see, PH. That's lapis, a whirlwind. That's a whirlwind. This amnos means to breathe constantly. This is the breath of the gods. Though, like I said, I couldn't tell if it's a secular word. And this is mysterion. That way, okay. If I keep to the same words, maybe we can get through it quicker. Because, let's go to Mark chapter 2 and 18. We had this last time. So, this is what I brought before. Mark chapter 2, 18. So, we have, what was the one just before this? What happened just before this? Just before this,
Tax collector.
the teacher of law, the tax collectors, yes, he's with the tax collectors. Now remember, the problem with this is everything is a logos to tell us. So I am trying consciously not to take this as stories, pieces, right? Let's try to make sure we remember and fit it together, because they can't be separated. It's all continuous logos to tell us. So anyway, John's disciples, Methides and the Pharisees, were fasting. I did this at the last one, and I want to do this. I want to get into this. They were fasting religiously, literally nisteo, from food. Some people, and this is mistranslated, it's not some people, it's literally they. It's the preposition for they. That is, John's learners and the Pharisees' learners came and asked, they made a logical argument. How is it that John's disciples and the disciples of Pharisees are fasting, but yours are not? And, okay, I want you to see this. Remember, who was it that at first, when Jesus first started his thing, who came to him?
Disciples of John.
It was John's disciples.
Well, it was the people, right? The people came to him. And then, who started coming with the people?
Scribes, Pharisees.
The grammateus, right? And then, now we've got John's disciples. And before John's disciples, we had the Pharisees, right? Pharisees. And now we have John's disciples. The thing that the point I'm trying to make here is, do you see what's happening? Do you see what Mark is telling us? First he gets attracts people, generally, right? And then we're getting the grammateus. I've tried to go through this because I don't know who John really means, or Mark really means with the grammateus. We know a grammateus is a person who, I've been over and again about what a grammateus is in Greek culture, right? So just generally, we could say that a grammateus is a person who's literate. So does this mean that the people who are unliterate and then those who are literate? Now there's something very important here, because every Jewish man was supposed to be
Literate of the law.
somewhat literate. I mean, literate to the point that they knew the what? Well, the Torah. The whole thing, right? I know. They knew the whole Torah. They recited it. They had it memorized. So they were literate in the Torah. And the Torah was written in Hebrew. Did they speak Hebrew? No. They spoke Aramaic and Greek and Latin. So this means that, what do you think literate means to a Greek?
To understand what you've written.
Knowing Greek. Greek, yes. Because a person who didn't know Greek was a barbaros, right? A barbarian. So I think we're getting a clearer picture of what a grammateos may be. Because if the people are those who maybe know Hebrew, the men who know Hebrew, right, but don't necessarily read Greek, this would also include those who know Greek but can't read it, right?
Speak but not read.
The grammateus are those who are literate in
Greek.
Greek.
So they're using the people to translate from Hebrew into Greek.
And I suspect they are, I'm going to take a leap here. I think they're the rabbis. So when it says this, because, why? Because of LXX,
Which is Greek.
which is Greek. Because in this day, remember today it's illegal. It is illegal, well, illegal. It is religiously illegal to read a Torah scroll from the LXX.
So they have to guess about the Hebrew.
In Hebrew. Yeah, they have to guess about the Hebrew because they don't know what it really means. They're not fully sure what it means. They got to memorize it, but they don't use the language. And Aramaic is significantly different. Matter of fact, modern Hebrew, do you know what modern Hebrew does? It takes the Arabic vowels and puts it into the Hebrew consonants. And they did that in the 800s. That's what the Masoretes did. The Masoretes re-resurrected Hebrew by going to the Arabs. And they took the Arabic vowels and put them into the Hebraic system. That's where they got the pointlets, by the way. You ever notice that Arabic pointlets vowels look very similar to Jewish Hebrew? Isn't that interesting? So,
Well, this is also one of the things of Islam. They say that they know better what was written than we do, because potentially what we're talking about here is they used Aramaic and Arabic, of which Islam is noted for.
Aramaic is a different language, and it's very akin to Hebrew, but the pronunciations are different. And there is some Aramaic in the Old Testament, notably in Daniel. So, it gets complicated. Now, someone asked the question, are the Pharisees the same as the rabbis? No, maybe so. We don't know to what degree.
It was a political appointment.
But, well, it's kind of like what everyone wants to do. And how did you become a Pharisee? Well, I don't know. How did you become an Essene? Well, you kind of lived out in the desert, right? How did you become a zealot? Well, you lived out in the desert and killed people. Look. Now, we know how to become a Sadducee, right? How did you become a Sadducee? Only one way. Yeah, you had to be a Levite. A Levite or a Aaronite, right? Because to be a priest, you had to be, to be a Levite, to be a Sadducee, you had to be born into the family. So it's totally heredity, right?
So you needed a genealogy, but they lost a great deal of that during the Maccabean issues.
Well, matter of fact, they lost it all because anyone know what Josephus tells us that Herod the Great did to the genealogy scrolls?
Destroyed them.
He burned them. Why? Anybody know?
So you can't prove who's who.
So
Why?
you couldn't understand his lineage. He came from
He was an Edomite.
Edomite.
He was an Edomite, and no Edomite was supposed to ever ever enter the temple, much less be, of the lineage of David. He couldn't be the lineage of David because he was an Edomite. It's impossible, right? Well, maybe, unless,
Prove it.
Well, David left children everywhere he went. He had this problem. I don't think it's a very positive thing. So did Solomon. Obviously, father and son following each other, and I don't think they're going to stand up very well, with the heavenly chorus. But anyway, David may have left a whole bunch of Edomite children. Who knows? But not in the genealogy scrolls. So Herod the Great destroyed them all, which, by the way, means that there's only one generation until we have pure DNA mapping. I mean, perfect DNA mapping. There's only one generation you can know who Jesus was as Messiah. Right? In that generation. So that's kind of interesting. Anyway, but if you notice, went to the Grammateus, the literate Greek rabbis, and then to the Pharisees.
Would you back up on that one just a little bit, that because it's written in the Bible, the whole genealogy all the way through?
Oh no. As a matter of fact, remember, there are gaps, but there are other scrolls. You know, okay, look. This is something that really disturbs me, all right? We have been taught that there's only one ancient document in the whole world, ever, and that is the Old Testament, right? Look, there isn't. Matter of fact, because we have been so blinded about other documents, why do we want to get into other documents? There's two reasons. Since the Age of Enlightenment. Before the Age of Enlightenment, there was no problem. People studied those other ancient documents like crazy, right? But after the Age of Enlightenment, they stopped. Christians stopped. Why?
Because they were not in the canon.
The Age of Enlightenment did something amazing for us. We got Daniel Defoe. And Daniel Defoe wrote the first fictional novel in English. And when Daniel Defoe did that, basically Cervantes and a couple of other people in other places did it. But when Daniel Defoe did it, it caused an uproar historically. Because he wrote first person in a diary style, past tense. It was
History, by his perspective.
He was writing false history.
Historical fiction.
And people couldn't tell the difference. Remember, he wrote the diary of, what's her name, the prostitute, and he wrote Daniel Defoe, Robinson Crusoe. There were three major novels he wrote in English. Because of Daniel Defoe, we had to invent something. Fiction. So all of a sudden, everybody knew what fiction was and what fiction wasn't until Daniel Defoe.
And he blurred the lines.
After Daniel Defoe, right, if you read, for example, if you read, what's his name, Paradise, not Paradise Lost, what I'm looking for, the famous Christian novel about Pilgrim's Progress. Pilgrim's Progress. Pilgrim's Progress. Pilgrim's Progress. Nobody had any problem with Pilgrim's Progress. They knew it was fiction. It was evident, self-evident fiction to them, right? It's obviously fiction, right? Or if you have the Greek myths and the Roman myths, it's obviously fiction. Or anyone who knew anything about, I brought examples to you. I should bring more. The problem is I don't bring enough. You know, if you read the Manus, you know, the Zoroastrians' book, if you read the Hindus' book, if you read the Book of the Dead, all of those are what?
Fiction.
They're spells, they're poetry, they're fiction, they're self-evident fiction because they're unprovable, right? Within a historical context. But if I give you the Old Testament documents, what do they appear to be? Just on the surface. History, right? And in the ancient times, before the Age of Enlightenment, no one had any problem. Because why? They accepted them as history, and to them they were self-evident. When you read the Odyssey and the Odyssey and the Iliad look a little bit like history, but they're not, because number one, it's a poem, and number two, it's myth, and they say it's myth. Yeah. It's not that the Odyssey and the Iliad, the Greeks weren't going around saying the Odyssey and the Iliad is fact. The Greeks went around and said the Odyssey and the Iliad is myth. It's myths to explain our gods. Now, what universe it happened in, we don't know, right? But the Greeks understood very well that it was a mythos. Okay? There was no question until the Age of Enlightenment. In the Age of Enlightenment, we had this problem. And really, you know, Daniel Defoe kind of caused it for us.
Da Vinci Code followed suit.
Well, there's lots of stuff like that. As a matter of fact, in the United States, it's kind of, well, we list usually books as fiction, nonfiction. In Europe, it's not. You know, for example, Von Daniken. You guys remember Von Daniken, Chariots of the Gods? In America, it came, well, in Germany, it came through as historical. Guess what it is? Guess what Von Daniken said it was? Fiction. He said none of this stuff could be proved. And he said, well, where's your data? He said, I don't need data. This is fiction. He says in the German marketplace, you don't have to identify fiction from nonfiction. Why? The Germans are still working on a kind of a pre-Enlightenment plane. Anybody ever read German fiction? I mean, look at Steppenwolf. Does that look like fiction to you? Can you tell? No, because even Nietzsche couldn't get it straight. I'm just saying, you know, if you look at cultures and you look how cultures do things, in America, we have got this great demarcation between fiction and nonfiction. And what just happened to the Bible? Anybody know what just happened to the Bible? Somebody just put this fiction section in Costco, I think, and it caused an uproar. You see? I don't know. You know, theologically, you could wonder if, why would you take a book that is so classically historical that the Greeks revered it as history in the ancient world, and you take it and there is nothing that disproves it. I mean, I've been through this before and over again about, you know, stuff, and yet you take it and you throw it on the ash heap of historical fiction, right? And even that's questionable. But yet it was revered through history as one of the greatest historical works ever made, ever written. Yes, sir.
Maybe I misunderstood you, but you said pre-Enlightenment, there were other ancient documents that were studied that we don't study now? Did I miss that?
Oh, yeah.
I don't know what you're referring to.
There are many. There's the Hammurabi Code. There is every Christian, well, I'll put it this way. Every enlightened Christian before the Enlightenment learned Latin and Greek. Every person before the turn of the 20th century learned Latin and Greek. They may not have been conversant in it, but they learned it. Why did they learn it?
That's where everything was written.
To study. Bingo! Because all of the classical Western documents are written in Latin and Greek. Today, we don't even teach our children the English translations. I have a library full of translations and Greek documents that are classics, that were read by all the founders of this nation. Livy, Caesar, Pliny, Tacitus, Euripides, you know, Socrates, you know, Plato actually. So, you know, there are documents, and you know, our children get piecemeal in school, but they used to be taught in Christian schools, and in those Christian schools they got those ancient documents, and guess where they put them? Right next to the Bible, Old Testament, New Testament, and they were able to make comparisons. I'm just saying, you know, I brought comparisons in, and you know, I can't understand them. There's no one who can understand half the stuff that was written in the ancient world. Some of it's wacky, okay? I mean, documents that are supposed to be religious type documents, okay? The Hindu, just try to read the Bhagavad Gita, the Gitas, any of the Gitas, and you'll see exactly what I'm saying. Some of that stuff is totally incomprehensible. But so is life, right? I'm just saying that this is a great mistake I think we've made, is because we've taken, and what has happened? The pastor did, I wish he wouldn't say it, but he does. He says, he calls them stories. I don't like it when you call them stories, because in English a story is fiction.
Potentially fiction.
Well, it sounds like.
In English, if we say I'm going to tell you if I'm going to tell you a story, who knows, right? It's a liar's game in English. But I'm just saying, I want us to be very clear. And the problem is that they were. Before the 20th century, they were very clear. Before the 20th century, they taught people about the historical method, scientific method, historical method, right? And logic. Today, we don't teach any. How many kids take logic classes? How many kids take classes in, what's that?
I said at the classical school of Wichita.
Well, Shazam, there you go.
But some of my husband's second cousins, their kids go there, and I'm just like blown away. They learn Latin from like kindergarten or whatever it is.
That's awesome.
Yeah, and they learn all that, and they read in high school. They read these documents in their original languages and stuff like that. It's a Christian school.
Well, it's like Trinity, it's a blessing. What those teachers expose our children to is awesome. They teach them atheist science, use atheist science books, and turn it around and pull in the Bible. What better situation in life to set them up, you know? There again, you wish we had more of it. And a lot of parents don't realize that opportunity. That is such a great investment to send your children there, preparing them for life versus the public school that can't touch it, and we're so careful. But thank God for places like this where there's hope.
Well, maybe when the Bible becomes fiction, total fiction, then they'll be able to teach it, right?
Yeah.
I bet. All of them have that, right?
Yeah, right.
I'm just saying, guys. You know, the thing is that the impression, the number one impression, and in my classes, I've brought you all kinds of documents, historical documents that talk about Christ, that prove Christ. But what do they tell you? What have you learned in school from your professors and your professorettes and from your?
We don't talk about that.
Well, no, they tell you what? They tell you that there are no historical sources outside the New Testament that talk about Jesus.
Not my professors.
Oh, you had good professors. You had classical professors. I'm just saying that when I was in school, was in high school and junior high school and in college, that's what I heard. And I read stuff over and over again that said there is no, and just digging past the patina on the brass, and guess what you find? Hundreds of documents that talk about Christus, or talk about Jesus, or talk about the guy who can't be named, or talk about, and you go, huh? You know, we are living in an irrational society, a society that's untrained in basic academics, and trained in basic historical research, in my opinion, and that are going the way of the dodo. Because if you can't educate the next generation, then the next generation is going to they're disappearing. Right? You wonder why children aren't coming back to Christianity, or not coming back to Lutheranism, or to wherever they're going. Right? It's because we are not passing on our knowledge. And many times we don't have the knowledge because we have generations since the turn of the 20th century that have not been educated properly, in my opinion. So anyway, I'm just trying to get, there's lots of stuff, there's all kinds of things. Let's go into...
And that was by design,
Yes,
by the way.
it was by design, is by design.
Why do you think so many public schools are named after atheists?
Oh, yeah.
It's the leftist education cabal that is doing it by design, so they have a compliant.
But why? Why do they think that way? I try so hard to understand the other side.
Well, just put your foot in the theological pool for a second and say, and this is truly a theological thing, if there was really an enemy of humanity that is trying to prevent truth from being passed on from generation to generation. Because remember, what is the number one thing that the Old Testament tells us to do? What did Jesus tell?
Teach your children.
To teach your children the Torah, right? And right, Jesus said that a person who misconstrues or doesn't teach children the Torah should be killed. A millstone should be put around their neck, and they should be thrown into the ocean. That's what Jesus said. Jesus liked, capital punishment, especially for those who mistrained the youth, children, in the Torah. Well,
as the Bible said, men in the darkness, they want their deeds to remain in the darkness, right? And so they can't have people be enlightened.
There can't be any sin either, right? If there's sin, then...
You're innocent.
They can't have people see what they're doing.
That's right. As a matter of fact, if everything's okay, then, and you don't need to be redeemed,
You don't
Who
know.
needs Christ?
then you don't need nothing. That's cool,
I can
right?
do it myself.
And guess what? You have a whole generations going to perdition. But it's okay. Sex before marriage, sex outside of marriage, sex here, sex there, sex with animals, sex with ducks. You know, whatever, right? I don't know.
Running that duck tubing.
The duck, I don't know. I'm just saying,
It's all
right?
marked, right?
So, Anyway, but, well, yeah, that's what I'm saying, you know, now what we just did is we opened our cultural Pandora's box, right? Because we don't even understand our own culture. We don't understand what's happening in our own culture. We'll look back in 10 years and say, oh, that wasn't very good. But it's too late.
We already are.
But
Right?
Lila, you know, you understand it, but what can you do about it? That's where the problem lies.
You do what I try to do in my work all the time. I know that, you know, the ship of a business or the ship of anything is gigantic and the tiller is small. But the only thing you can do as a leader or a person is you can turn a little bit. You get people on your side, you know, you try to tell the truth about what you know. You try to bring some kind of level of enlightenment to those who you can, and you just try to get the message out. And you do it, if you do it the right way, and see, this is why Christians were infiltrators from the beginning. We become not infiltrators, and we're trying to become cultural warriors. Well, I think we should go back to infiltration, you know. Sometimes picking off a few, you know, from the sidelines makes a lot better sense than, you know, walking into the fray with a big X on your chest, right? Using military kind of terms here, but I'm just saying that many times we, like for example, we've got this battle against Halloween. You know, there's a battle against Christmas, right? Well, you know, the way to fight the battle of Christmas is when someone says Happy Holidays, you say Merry Christmas, right?
Yeah.
Or you take the initiative to be forward in that, right? And the battle for Halloween, we should embrace Halloween. But instead, what do? I like what our church is doing. Our church is embracing it. I think we should embrace it more. I think we should have biblical Halloween parties, you know. I'll come as John the Baptist, right? With my head chopped off. I mean, that'd be really fun, wouldn't it? I mean, there's so many bloody characters from the Bible that would be really cool to be, right? And would give it kids, you know, and the thing is, you could even teach lessons that way, right? Say you had a biblical Halloween party where people didn't dress up like ghosts. Well, you could. There's ghosts in the Bible. Remember? Old Saul went to talk to a ghost or went to seek witches, and right? I mean, why don't we embrace this? This is our heritage. What are we afraid of? We're afraid of a lot. And until we conquer our fears, our children aren't going to learn, in my opinion. So I don't know.
And you made a good point. We're trying to jump right into the fray and face the battle head on, but secularism started off just a little bit here and there over time, slowly getting hold of the education where they saw that was the avenue into our children's minds, and they started building it up. And it was an infiltration, and that's the only way we're going to get it back.
And I'll
methodically.
I agree, and let me point this out to you. How effective have they been at education?
Extreme.
100%.
Or,
Successful.
Well, no.
Not truly educating what they want.
Yeah,
They've been
very
completely
successful.
Just look at our textbooks, look at everything.
Yeah, well, they scream reading, writing, and arithmetic, right?
No history.
Yeah.
Well, they scream it, but what are our kids?
They can't read, they can't write, or do arithmetic.
They don't understand our
They can't
founding
do
fathers.
anything.
They just, oh my.
They can't read, they can't write, and they can't do arithmetic.
Probably the 3 R's.
Which tells me the agenda isn't to teach reading and writing or arithmetic.
No, it isn't.
What is the agenda? It's to teach something else. In fact, if you read Dewey, if you read matter of fact, okay, let's just go back. Who advised us to have public education? Who's the #1 person? No, Marx. Marx. The Communist Manifesto.
One of the 10 planks or whatever, communism is universal public education.
That's right. That's one of the 10 planks of communism. It didn't come from Ben Franklin. Matter of fact, there was no public education during Ben Franklin's era because it didn't work. Public education was not a successful venture. It never has been a successful venture. It just takes a long time for stuff to collapse. But if your agenda is not to teach reading, writing, and arithmetic, it's not even to teach sex ed.
Well, yeah, it is, but it's homosexual kind of stuff.
Well, my wife has to deal with these kids that come out of the public school systems who don't even know what the A, B, and C of sex. They have no clue.
that's.
So they're not effective. They're teaching them how to have sex, but they're not teaching them sex education. See? I'm just saying, guys, look at the results. But the problem is that we as Christians, the 10 plan, well, I don't know, my kids got taught about the Communist Manifesto. They went to a private parochial school, and one of their documents was to read the Communist Manifesto. And they got taught the 10 planks of communism. As a negative, right, you teach about history. You don't hide history, you teach it, right? And one of the best examples is looking at Marx's stuff. Guess what? We've embraced them all. But that's okay, because they're just history, right? If people knew. Anyway, sorry. I love this because, really, like I said, we look culturally at Mark and we open Pandora's boxes. We look at our own culture, and guess what? The same Pandora's boxes kind of exist. The same kind of things.
You can read the New Testament documents, the epistles and stuff, and Timothy, and it will talk about, the evil people and so on, what they do, and it's exactly the same as what's going on right now.
Yeah.
Exactly the same.
As a matter of fact, I think, people think we're going, I think Christianity, for all the negatives that may have happened in history, Christianity it's reverting. The world is reverting back to the Greek era in a large measure. But even the Greeks had more morality than a lot of times our own culture. Because at least the Greeks knew when to keep their pants on and when not to keep their pants on. They had at least social strictures, and they weren't obese because they didn't eat meat very often, right? They couldn't eat. They were starvation cultures. People are starving in these cultures, literally. So, we've got a affluent culture that doesn't know, where the Greeks were at least, the poorest Greek was seeking what? Education. The poorest Hebrew was seeking what? Education. Our poor is seeking, I don't know what our poor is seeking. It's not education,
Free stuff.
Free stuff.
And nothing's free.
And nothing is free. That's the problem. But,
If
okay.
people understood that concept,
Oh, I've been
we would
teaching
be
my fourth
so
graders
much
that
better
way.
off.
It's not free.
Anyway, back to Mark. Okay. And I think we were doing Mark, but let's see, back to Mark. The Pharisees, the reason we see this is we're making a step in to Pharisees and now to John's disciples. And we can identify the Pharisees really well. The Pharisees, right? And John's disciples are probably, I think they're Essenes. Essenes. But we know they did include some zealots, right? Because we're going to find one, zealots. We're going to find a zealot who actually becomes one of the disciples of Christ. So the thing that's very interesting here is that, number one, we are seeing a progression, right? Did you ever notice this progression in Mark before? See, this is a progression that Mark wants you to see. To the ancient world, this is an obvious progression. The progression is from the illiterate to the literate and rabbis to the Pharisees, who are Torah trained, who are definitely the rabbis and also the leaders, right? To a degree. There's only 4 of them on the Sanhedrin. To John's disciples, who represent the zealots and the Essenes, who do you think the next group will be? Sadducees. Sadducees. And potentially the leaders. Because the Sadducees represent the Sanhedrin, which is the Jewish leadership, right? And who are these leaders? Pilate, Herod. If you've read ahead in Mark, you know who does begin to get the message of Jesus. Starts with the people. This is very interesting too, because, and I'll point this out, the most effective South American ministries have ministered not to the people, but to the educated class. Usually, though, with our missionaries, where do we start?
Schools.
The people, yeah. So if you win over the people, then you get the attention of the literate, educated, of these. I don't know, if you're looking, I'm not looking necessarily for a method, I'm just pointing out what we see, this progression in Mark, which I think is a very important progression.
Now,
But it,
the Gentiles, would those be lumped in with the people then?
yeah, because, you know, I think it's very interesting.
So non-Jews are lumped in with the people.
Well, remember, Mark is writing to
Non-Jews.
non-Jews, yeah, Gentiles. And so when you read this in Greek and you see it says the people, or it says the groups, or the whatever, the teknon, right, the worthless, what do you see? You see you, right? It's you. When it says people and it's a Greek document, it's going to be you, right? Now, we see, I think this is really interesting, because who do we see? We don't see us, do we? When you read about the people in the New Testament, do you see you? I think it's the way we've approached teaching it. Because in the Greeks are reading a document that they know is historical, that they're reading it right now, right? All these documents are written before the end of the first century. So they see themselves, and they see this as writing to them. Yet we see it all as writing to
His people hundreds of centuries ago.
yeah, somebody else, right? I don't know. I think it's very interesting.
But when John started his ministry, he was one crying out in the wilderness, and he was starting with the people as well.
Yep. And if you notice in John ended up attracting Pharisees, and we find that in Matthew and Luke, right? Pharisees and Sadducees, etc. We need to move along, but the point that I made last week was, remember that the Pharisees and the Sadducees, or the Pharisees and John's disciples are fasting at the same time, which gives you an indication that they may be zealots. Also gives an indication that the Essenes and the Pharisees are on the same timetable, which is very interesting. The reason for that is because, and I guess I shouldn't go into great detail because it'll take too much. Well, I guess I'll mention it. I'll mention it because it's really important. You know that Jesus had his Last Supper. The Last Supper that Jesus had was a Seder meal. But it was on the wrong day, wasn't it? Do you know why?
They weren't on the Julian calendar?
No, the Essenes followed the Torah. The Pharisees may have followed the Torah, we don't know, but they went along. The Sadducees didn't follow the Torah. What they did is they moved the date of the Passover to the Shabbat after the Passover, after the full moon. You know why they did it? They did it for the diaspora. They did it because it's difficult to tell when the new moon or when the full moon is all over the world. So they did it on the Shabbat. Number one, they did it on the Shabbat to make it for commercial viability, because that's when the sacrifices had to be done in the temple. And they did it specifically because it's very difficult to determine when the new moon is. They even went to the point, and by the way, why is this important? Because the Passover has to be held by every Jew. It's one of the things you have to do, or it's one of the 36s that if you don't do them, what happens? There's no sacrifice. You can't be forgiven. Period. Done. So the big problem for this is so that everyone could do the Passover, they moved it intentionally to that date. However, the Essenes didn't buy it. The Essenes, we know for a fact, kept the original Torah calendar. We're not sure about the Pharisees. We think the Pharisees, we don't know. But you notice that John's disciples potentially Essenes. That's why I said they could be zealots, they're probably Essenes, keeping the same calendar with the Pharisees. But it's interesting that Mark calls that out. This is kind of historically. Anyway.
Now you said Jesus you thought was an Essene.
Yes, Jesus is probably an Essene.
But but he's not fasting at the same time John is. John's followers, and they're in a season.
They're doing an optional fast. And remember, the Pharisees were, that was one of the things about the Pharisees, right? That they were culturally diverse. No, not diverse. They're culturally fastidious, right? They're fastidious about following what they thought was the proper, and they're not following the Torah, they're following the Talmud, right? So they're big time into the Talmud. The Essenes are big time into the Torah and to the direct Torah thing. However, the Essenes have a bunch of writings. You know what those writings are called today? The Essene writings are the Dead Sea Scrolls. And there's a whole bunch of Gnosticism in there. Not all the Dead Sea Scrolls are Essene writings, but there are a lot of Essene writings in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And we still haven't. This is another thing that really irks me. Before the 20th century, if there was a new Dead Sea Scroll that came out, what would every Christian that was literate in the world do? They'd buy it and read it. Today, what do? Oh, it's just...
It's important someone else will read it and tell us about it.
Ooh, that strikes the heart, But that's kind of true, isn't it? It's kind of true, because we're not doing what we did in the past. Many people don't read. Well, there are a lot of readers. It's very interesting. But the world is becoming separated in our culture between readers and non-readers. Yeah. Readers and TV watchers. That's kind of scary. Anyway, 19. Jesus answered, and this is very important. How can the guests, the huios, the offspring, okay. First of all, it's not guests. How can the huios, how can the offspring of the bridegroom, of the numphon, the bridal veil, fast, that is, nusteo, abstain from food for religious reasons, while the nymphos, the bridegroom, the husband who escorts the veiled bride, is with him? They cannot so long as they have him, that is the nymphos, the bridegroom. All right. This is one of those cultural Pandora's boxes, and I'm going to have to do this because there's no way we can understand this without understanding what's going on. First of all, what is the numphon? All these words come from this one word, the numphon. Numphon. In the ancient world, sex is marriage is sex. So until you have sex, you are not married. They don't have licenses, guys, and they don't have ceremonies like we think of ceremonies. What they did is they consecrated them and did their ceremonial stuff, and then what did the bridegroom and the bride do? No, they had sex. And the way they did it is there was a tent set up. It's marked in an Orthodox wedding. You'll see this tent. It's called the nymphon. It's the veiled tent. And look, they even did it in Christianity for many years, because if you go into some of the bigger churches in Rome, you'll find there's a numphon there. A numphon is a veiled area where the bridegroom had sex. And Merrick, I don't agree that there were watchers. They have some show about Henry VIII or something, and they're showing the ladies in waiting and whatever, watching them have sex. That is not historical. We don't believe that's true. They did not watch. They put them in a thing, and maybe they were listening. I don't know what's going on, but behind this closed area, they are supposed to have sex, because sex is marriage and marriage is sex. There is no license. There is no ceremony. The reason you were married in the ancient world and in the world until the government got involved with it was through sex, period. So the numphon is this thing. And the Greeks have numphons, and the Hebrews have numphons, and every culture, by the way, has a numphon until the modern era. In the modern era, you get a license. And that government gives you a license to have sex. Although they don't punish you for not having sex with a license. But anyway, the numphon, if I change this, I also have the bridegroom, who is the veiled bridegroom. The veil is, let's see, what is he called? He is called the nymphos. Theos. And then the bride is the nymphos, where's the veil bride? I think it's nymphio, anyway. Nymphia. Jesus says, not the guests, but how can the offspring of the sex between the bride and the groom, literally, how can they abstain from food when the bride and the groom are with them still? After they had this event, then they had the feast. The feast comes after this. Okay? In some cultures, like the Hebrew culture, the feast later came in the next day, by the way. Because in the Hebrew culture, the bridegroom, they don't have a numphon until they were Hellenized. After they Hellenized, they had a numphon, right? Because we know that from the Hebrew culture, the bridegroom took the bride into the bridal chamber that was usually in the father-in-law's house, his father-in-law's house, right? And then the next day they would have the feast. Or maybe they were feasting, well, usually they had the feast the next day. In any case, in Greek culture, you have this tent. And by the way, Christian culture absorbed the Greek culture. This is what we did for a bagillion years. This is the way it worked. Now, 20, but the time will come when the bridegroom, the nymphos, will be taken, literally lifted off, apario from them, and on that day they will fast. By the way, why do you fast? I got this last week, but why do you fast? You fast to repent. There's only one reason to fast, is for repentance. And that's why they're fasting. The Pharisees and John's disciples are fasting up to Yom Kippur. Because Yom Kippur is when they're forgiven. So you're fasting for repentance. Why do they not need to fast? Number one, they're huios. They're the offspring, the children. So Jesus is saying they're, number one, they're children, they're not responsible. Remember, child of worth, right? See, we can't understand this without understanding the parakleo thing before this. Because in the parakleo thing, Jesus called the huios a child of worth. He said you're not worthless anymore. What has Jesus been doing this whole time? He's been taking the worthless and giving them worth. So, as long as you are repentant, you have worth. As long as you're repentant, you don't need to repent because you're forgiven, right? Jesus said, your sins are forgiven, take up, right? So, all this comes directly out of it. I mean, this is like a huge logos to telos event here. It goes on to say in 21, no one sews a patch. No one stitches, epheriato, a patch, emblema, of unshrunk agathos, not washed cloth. Of not washed cloth, rakos, a rag, on an old apleos document, a hymeon. Literally, a hymeon is an outer robe. If he does, the new, literally the fresh, the kenios piece, fills it up and will pull away, aereo, lift away from the old, the antique, making a split, a schisma, worse, more bad physically and morally. All right, you got to understand this. This is really important. This is one of those parables that no one ever understands, right? And no one gives you a good explanation. I'm going to give you the explanation of how this works and why it is. All right. What does it mean? Okay, when the bride and the groom, when the nymphios and the nymphia go into the nymphon, what are they wearing? We do it today. Brides wear white. In the old days, the man wore a white robe, the woman wore a white robe. They were new robes. Okay? Clothing is very expensive in the ancient world. If you wore an old bridal robe, what does it mean?
You're poor.
Nope. It means you were married before. It means you were married before. Okay, if the bridegroom comes and he's got a patched bridal robe, he was previously married. If the bride wears a patched bridal robe, she was previously married. In other words, they came to the bridal numphion impure. Jesus isn't making a negative statement necessarily about marriage. His point is to give you a cultural picture. In other words, the offspring of the numphion are what? Children of worth. They're not full of sin because they are repentant. Right? They don't need to fast because they're forgiven. The bride and the groom who are coming are what? Pure. It's their first marriage. They haven't been married before. So this patch represents that. And unfortunately, we're going to have to wait till next week to gain more. But you see this, you know, you take a single statement in Greek, and all of a sudden, bang, you open this cultural Pandora's box of information that's just enormous amount of information to even understand, to fully comprehend exactly what's going on. But the minute I explain it to you, you get it? It's pretty easy, isn't it? Say, I got that. So, in any case, thank you, Father, for your word. We pray that you look after us this week. In your name we pray, amen.